Welcome to Crossing Faiths. I'm John Pinna, and today we have a wonderful and interesting guest. We have a distinguished professor, Sahar Aziz, who's a distinguished professor of law at Rutgers University and chancellor's of social justice scholar at Rutgers as well. And she's also the founding director of the Center for Security and Race and Rights, which is the only center that's dedicated to civil and human rights of Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians. I brought her on today to speak about her book, which is The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religion and Freedom. And so if you'd like to get some information, we have saharazizlaw.com is where you can find all this information. But welcome so much. I thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So I saw your book and some of the work that you've done, and I said, oh, I got to have her on to talk about some of this stuff. And I know it came out in 2021, but it's becoming increasingly relevant and potentially more in the immediate moment. But first, I'd just like to chat a little bit about the work that you do, and because you are a professor of law, and you'd have to pull out the social justice scholar, the chancellor's a social justice scholar a little bit, but also you run this center. So maybe you could unpack those three things for us and our listenership.
Well, I think anyone who works on what we call post 9/11 discrimination, which unfortunately has become a permanent component of any type of domestic civil rights work in the United States, we all have a memory of where we were on 9/11. I mean, every American does. But the way that it's impacted those of us who have responded to that, atrocious terrorist attack and the long-term aftermath of it on the civil rights of Muslims in particular differs. And so for me, I was a first-year law student, and I went to law school wanting to work on the rule of law, democracy, and human rights in the Middle East, and with a specific interest in my country of origin and birth, Egypt. So I was very idealistic. I was a very typical American-raised college student who really believed that the U.S. had not a perfect political system and legal system, but one of the most promising in terms of protecting individual rights, including separation of powers, ensuring that it's very difficult for dictatorships to rise. And so I really believe that the legal structures were the country's strongest point.
Right.
I thought the thing about the American system is the pendulum can swing. So yes, it may sometimes swing towards more authoritarian practices, but the fact that we can swing it back, that is the promise of America. That is where you can't find that in any country. Once it swings one way or the other, it gets stuck there. And those who are the losers of that direction end up either being killed, tortured, exiled, deported. But here we go protest, we vote, we engage in advocacy. So when 9/11 happened, it was a huge traumatic moment for our communities, especially Muslim communities, that was kind of a double injury. So the first injury was as Americans, it was horrific.
It's going in and out. I don't know. We can edit up, but yeah, so you came out and came back in.
Okay, I don't know what's going on. All right, let me stay close. You can hear it now?
I can hear you. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, let me try that again.
Sure.
Okay, let's start again. Okay. So
Post 9/11.
right. So every American can remember where they were on 9/11. And those of us who have committed our careers to working on what has become post 9/11 discrimination, which unfortunately has become a permanent component of civil rights work in the US. That moment is what motivated us to make that long-term commitment. And so for me, I was a first-year law student, and I had gone to law school with very idealistic expectations and objectives that I would learn the law and hopefully apply it in my interest in international development and international rule of law and human rights work, with a focus on the Middle East and Egypt, which is my country of birth. And when you are raised in an immigrant family, you hear a lot of stories about the reasons why your parents left their home. It's very difficult to leave one's home. It's very difficult to leave one's language and family and culture and familiarity and sense of belonging. And one of the reasons that caused my family and many of their friends to leave was that the authoritarian political system did not give them the freedom to pursue their dreams, even economically. So even if you were not a political activist, which my parents were not, but it was just the corruption and the closed political system that really limited people's opportunities. So as a result, I had thought I'm going to go to law school and I'm going to work on these issues and try to kind of be a liaison between these two worlds. But 9/11 completely destroyed my hopes of being able to do that, because I witnessed alongside everyone else in the United States, at least what I interpreted as a massive threat to domestic civil rights and civil liberties. The hysteria, the backlash, the government overreach and overreaction to what was admittedly a horrific event. I mean, 9/11 is not to be taken lightly. But unfortunately, it was creating an opportunity for people in the government who I think did not have the best of intentions to pursue political agendas and legislative agendas that they had been trying to pass in the 90s that were infringing on civil liberties and that was going to give the executive branch an enormous amount of power. And 9/11 provided that opportunity. And who were the first targets? Who were the easy targets? The Muslims. So you could tell the American citizens who otherwise, in the abstract, supported civil liberties, supported civil rights, well, we have to do this to protect you from them. We have to surveil more. We have to investigate more. We have to have more FBI agents, and we have to have more, engage in more activities that otherwise are quite un American and that may chill free speech and that may chill political dissent. But we have to do this to protect you from these savage, barbaric, dangerous Muslims. Even though these 4 to 6 million people in America, which is less than 1% or just a little above 1% population, had nothing to do with 9/11. Right?
Right.
This was completely an international foreign uh, terrorist attack. So all that is to say that, since then, I have been trying to work with others in my community and outside the Muslim community to ensure that post 9/11 discrimination is no longer a structural threat to both Muslim community civil rights, but also all of Americans' civil rights. And unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Yeah, it's an interesting moment in time, because we're I think all of our lives changed. From I was in the national security space, and then from there, as an American Muslim, and then on top of that, trying to figure out how we navigate those waters. I think it changed. It's an interesting way of looking at it. I didn't think of it that way, where it completely changed the opportunity for what I was trying to do. I think I was born in '75, so we're similar age. I don't want to don't ask how old you are. I'm going to be a good gentleman, but
I'm much younger than you.
yeah, I think they're 10 or 15 years younger. So at least. So the reality is, though, is that I think that it changed the opportunity for when you were looking forward, because I was idealistic at the time as well. I was really excited about going to Russia and spending time and going into my history degree, and it completely changed the course of my national security career, my international development. So we're set the stage. We have the backdrop of 9/11. Now, did you feel that you were put into a box, or did you see this as an opportunity? Because you're, I mean, you've got all these, you're part of a center. You're arbitrating and being judicious when it comes to civil rights issues, and you're a fellow and a professor and a scholar, and you're an author. Did it seem as though it was an opportunity, or did it seem as an impediment to your career goals, and was there a time of troubles before you muddled through and figured it out?
Well, I think anyone who was a member of a Muslim community in the US who was integrated into any Muslim community, they're very diverse, they're across the country. We all felt a sense of siege, and we all felt a sense of responsibility to do something, to say something. And people took different approaches. There were the duck and hide folks, which were primarily the older Muslims who had been raised abroad in authoritarian states where their instinctive response was to keep their mouths shut, keep their heads down, and just hope that this would pass. But the generation like mine that was raised in America, we were taught in American schools, and we were taught that injustice is not something that you accept, especially in the United States. And we were fed that a myth, and it is a myth, that America was this country where you could fight for your rights and not have to pay a very high price. And the reason I say it's a myth is because what we saw, especially in the first 8 years after 9/11, is the price was quite high if you spoke out, because you would be called a terrorist. You would be subjected to surveillance. You would have the FBI come and knock on your door, come to your workplace, and put you under this cloud of suspicion, or set you up to make a false statement so they could charge you with this pretextual charge because they couldn't find anything on you that you were a terrorist. And so if people were getting fired from their jobs, they were getting harassed, and all of this I talk about in the book. So the stakes were quite high if you did speak up. But for better or worse, those of us who were raised here, who went to school here, we were so American that we had the audacity
Yeah.
to fight for our rights and to say, no, you cannot treat us like second class citizens. No, we will not go back in time to 50, 60 decades ago, or 50, 60 years ago, when it was acceptable to be racist. Not that racism is gone, but it is important that it is not acceptable, that it is not mainstream, that there is a political and social cost to being a racist. And what we saw, and we continue to see, unfortunately, today, right, it's June 19th, 2025, is that it is still politically acceptable and actually beneficial to be Islamophobic. You have politicians who go around spewing the most stereotypical textbook Islamophobic tropes, which is Muslims are terrorists or sympathizers of terrorism. Muslims are illiberal and opposed to democracy. Muslims are disloyal and these permanent foreigners. Muslims are misogynistic and anti women, and Muslims are presumptively anti-Semitic, and they, are taught to hate Jews. All of that is false. That is not to say there aren't individuals who, in fact, fit that profile, but like any group of people, that is a stereotype, right? And so if you find a criminal, like there is a white man who's 57 who identifies as a Trump supporter who just went and murdered a legislator, a woman, a white woman who is a legislator in Minnesota, and
Right.
her husband, and also attempted murder to another legislator. There's nothing in the media saying we have a problem with white male conservatives. There's nothing in the media saying we've got a domestic terrorist problem with white male Trump supporters.
Or
Because
Christian. He was a pastor in Africa, so like that doesn't come up at all. That should
right.
that is
And that's how racism works. Is
okay.
when you are judged individually by the worst actions and the wrongdoing of others who you have no connection to except a common identity, right?
Right.
Whether it's a racial identity, a religious identity, a gender identity, a national origin identity. And so as long as we do that with Muslims, we have an Islamophobia, a systemic structural Islamophobia problem, as opposed to an individual bad apple Islamophobia problem. So in order to do that line of work, you, like any civil rights work, it can't be done just in the courts. It can't be done just in the political system. It can't be done just in media or academia. In civil rights work, if you study the civil rights movements, and it's plural, which have consistently been led by African American communities, you will see that it is a very holistic approach because there's the law and then there's power, and the two are intertwined.
Yeah, well, this is really it's interesting because I when I saw the title of your book, I thought it said the radical Muslim, right? That's that. So, and
Which, by the way, shows how you have been, right? That's a mental play because you're so used to seeing those two words together.
right. Well, we used to do this thing. In my earlier in my career, we used to had this thing called the Witness Series, and it would be like shared persecution of two different faith groups. I had a it was Hans Deep Singh, who was a Sikh member of the Sikh community, and then there was me, and we did a little talk, and there was a series of talks, and I remember being stopped at the airport, and because someone see something, say something, see something. I think that's the law. I wrote an article, a scholarly article about that. But it's such a broad thing. It's like I feel like I'm being threatened, therefore. But someone had done that, and so it was a small airport in upstate New York, Stuart Newburgh, and they stopped me, and they stopped. There was only two gates, but only one of the gates was open, and so everyone is stopped at the gate, and because I have a beard, everyone's searching me, and we made this sort of statement. It made this sort of statement to everybody where all these little kids were sitting there and they were crying, and they didn't. They were being socialized with the idea that someone who looks like me with a beard and with this and that, and we mentioned that in the event. And so that comment that you made is that how it's like those words come together. It was because it's the racial Muslim, and I saw the radical Muslim at first, and I go, I had to look again, but that's because there's a collective sort of anxiety from those events, even internally within the community, and and I was kind of projecting that onto the title of your book. But so the question is, when it comes to the racial Muslim, I found it fascinating how the use of that term and when you're and coupling it with the Muslim community, and maybe you could just describe that the how that came to be and really what it means in the context of the book.
Well, the book is a culmination of, at that time, I had been working on post 9/11 discrimination for about 18 years. And so it's really a culmination of my experience in the field, whether it was as an intern for the ACLU, I was a law student, whether it was pro bono advocacy for nonprofits who were focused on the civil rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians, or as a scholar who was now writing and publishing on these issues. And in the beginning, I was admittedly kind of fell in the same, I think, false frame that many of us are taught, which is that religious
Right.
discrimination against religious minorities, you need to go through the religious freedom framework. And if you're trying to deal with racial discrimination, you go through the race and racism framework. And so
Right.
initially, I was working on religious freedom and thinking, oh, this is just a misunderstanding about the theology of Islam. The
Right.
problem is that Americans do not understand Islam as a global religion. They don't understand how culture and religion intersect, how class and religion intersect, the different debates within Islamic law and Islamic history and Islamic culture. And it is extremely complicated because 1.8 billion people in the world practice this world faith, and they live in vastly different cultures and speak different languages. And it's similar to Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa, is completely
Yeah.
majority religion here in the US. They understand that. And so we thought, well, we just need to make them understand that Islam is no different. And
Right.
so when you learn about these hijackers, you need to understand the context that caused them to do that as individuals, and understand that the militant groups, Al Qaeda, and then after that Daesh, that they are militant groups like any other, and you need to understand the political and social and economic context and how they weaponize religion to justify their political objectives. So
Sure.
for us, it was a no-brainer, but
Yeah.
realized very quickly that, though at least I did, is that okay, it doesn't really matter what you tell them and what you teach them, right? When I'm talking them, meaning Christians and Jews who were in positions of power and decision making, who
Sure.
clearly just didn't have the educational background. That even when they accepted those historical facts, they were so indoctrinated to see Muslims so foreign that it was as if they were a different race.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized, okay, this isn't about religious freedom. This isn't about, oh, you want to wear a headscarf, but we have a hat, no hats policy, and you're going to need to assimilate into our culture. No, this was more of by virtue of you being a Muslim, we impute upon you these inferior characteristics as if it was your skin color. Because in the US, race is phenotypically grounded, right? In
Right.
India, it's casteism, which has
Sure.
nothing to do with your skin color, it's other factors. So in the US, race is the master category that historically has been the most influential in determining an individual or a group, a racial group's opportunities, health outcomes, wealth, income, employment, how they're treated in public. Of course, that's changed over time, but for better or worse, people treat you differently based on your skin color and based on what you physically look like within certain racial categories that, again, they're totally socially constructed. I'm not saying that race is a biological fact.
Sure.
And so once you realize that Muslim identity is essentially being treated the same as Black identity or Latino identity or Asian identity, it completely changes how to approach the problem. Right?
Right.
You realize, yes, we still should be educating people about world religions, any religion. We should just be well educated and not homogenize them and not be reductionist about them. But no amount of education is going to address this other problem, which is you see me as somehow inherently inferior or dangerous or as an outsider simply because I'm Muslim. And that's why I created in my book the typology of the racial Muslim, because you will have Muslims who honestly and accurately will say, well, I'm Muslim, but I haven't experienced discrimination.
Sure.
I'm Muslim and I really don't know what you're talking about. This sounds like an exaggeration, which is true. And many you'll see the same phenomena within Black communities, Latino communities, within women, because there is always a hierarchy. And so what I argue is that the Muslims that are the most targeted by the national security state, by white nationalists, by people who hold very strong anti-Muslim views or suspicions towards Muslims, they tend to start by targeting those who are dissident politically and who are religious. So if
Right.
you are a very devout Muslim and you are a political dissident, you are perceived as the most dangerous racial Muslim. After that, you're religious, but you're not political. But the fact that you're religious makes people suspicious that are they teaching you in your faith to be a stealth terrorist, to be a terrorist supporter, to support terrorism behind the scenes, right? To be a Trojan horse, even though you're not political. You're not expressing opposition to the Iraq war. You're not expressing opposition to U.S. foreign policy in Israel, Palestine, etc. But the fact that you're religious makes me very suspicious because those people, the Islamophobes, believe that Islam is a political ideology,
Right.
not a religion, and that's a fallacy. And then it's the political dissident racial Muslim who's not religious at all, but they protest and they speak out and they write op-eds and they embrace their Muslim identity, but they might not be practicing Muslims. And then finally, the perfect Muslim, the ideal Muslim, the model minority Muslim is the Muslim who is not very religious or devout or practicing, and also is either not political at all or just mainstream politics. I'm Democrat, I'm Republican, I'm totally within the system, and I'm not. I'm totally assimilated politically and culturally. And so the question becomes, when you hear those stories of, well, I haven't experienced anything, you should ask that question in addition to the context. They may also be fortunate to be in a small community that knows them so well that they know better than to say, oh, you're a bad person. I've went to school or worked with you for 25 years. But there is always a hierarchy, and it exists again with other minorities.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, my brother is darker than I am, and he's in the movie business, and so he wears like the jeans and the M65 sort of marmite jacket, and it's a terrible moment in time when during post 9/11 there was moments where he was on because he lived in New York. He would be on the platform, and everybody would be on one side, and he would just be on the one. It would be just be us on the other side, and it was because he is darker and he looked like a guy that that was a little off because he was wearing like a military jacket with jeans, like whatever stereo. And so, and me, I'm a good old boy. I drive a pickup truck, and when I have a baseball cap on, I'm kind of a good old boy in upstate New York. But I always wear my dopey and always wear something like this. But I'm more comfortable wearing a kurta with jeans. But I don't generally do that because if I walk, I live in upstate about 100. I live in Kingston, New York. So if I walk down the street with a kurta, I'm like, and my dopey, it's like, you're worried a little bit about what's going on. Although I try to outwardly express it, but that's a reflection of the element. But I never thought about it from a racial perspective. Like I never kind
Well,
of
I think the other thing you need to keep in mind is it's long before 9/11. Someone may wear what we call kind of cultural heritage dress, something that is worn in Pakistan or Afghanistan or
yeah,
some other foreign country, and they may get looks. Uh, but the question is, what's the response? There's the response of, oh, that's so interesting, or that's so exotic, or okay, that's different, or that's not very professional. After 9/11, the response was much more threatening. It was, you are a threat. I
right,
need to call the police.
recently.
Are you associated with Al Qaeda? Are you trying to impose Sharia law? That is a starkly different response than before and after. And the consequences are much more dangerous to the Muslim. So the pressure to hide your identity and to
Yeah,
keep quiet is much more intense. And then that circles back to, well, then do you really have religious freedom? Do you really have freedom of speech? And that's part of the chilling effect, because one sign of religious freedom, and it's somewhat superficial, but we shouldn't underestimate it, and this is a global phenomena or an observation, is if you see religious minorities in a particular country wearing things that communicate their status and they do it openly, that's a positive sign. It doesn't
mm,
mean there's no religious bigotry or religious discrimination, but it means it's at a low enough level that people are not afraid to wear a cross in a Muslim country, right? To wear a yarmulke in a predominantly Christian or Jewish, predominantly Christian or Muslim country, to wear a hijab in a predominantly Christian country. When they're afraid to do that, or when they're not doing it, and it's a very conscious choice because of fear, not I just don't believe in doing it and it's my own individual choice, that is a sign that there is a problem. There is a religious bias problem. And when they're actually discriminated against in a direct way, that's the most egregious form of religious bias. That's usually when things have built up. But if you really want to be preventative, and if you want to observe or believe that it's an environment of tolerance, you should be able to see people express and show their religious differences without them being afraid. So I'll give you an example. It's a very common practice in Muslim majority countries to have a Quran in your car.
right,
Some cultures believe it because it kind of God protects you when you're driving so you don't have an accident. Some people actually will read the Quran before they start driving, like they'll say a prayer, because car accidents happen. And some people will do it just to remind them as a symbol of faith.
sure.
But it's a very common practice. And I used to do that because it was just a tradition. And after 9/11, I took my Quran and I took it out of my car because I was afraid my car would get vandalized.
Yeah, or
And
someone see it and then see something, say like I,
Well,
my
right. By seeing the Quran, I was afraid they would say that car belongs to a Muslim, and now I'm going to go and vandalize this car as a way of collective revenge after 9/11 because people were so angry. But I had never ever had to even think about that. I mean,
yeah,
putting a Quran in my car was just it wasn't even a concern of mine. But that's how afraid we were. And I had no accent. I was raised in America. I had a college degree and was pursuing a graduate degree. Imagine what Muslims who were new to the country, who have an accent, who might not have a college degree, how vulnerable they felt.
yeah, yeah. And it's interesting, like there's these subtle changes that you made, and like I still keep them up. I don't have, there's certain things I just don't do because of. I think we've all had little hurdles over the course of the last 20 some odd years, and I'm involved. I'm in the game, and I still am not. I still am very careful about certain things, and I know, but so I know we I think we've unpacked a little bit about this racial identity, the racial Muslim. I when it comes to someone on the outside trying to understand this from a perspective of I know we'll have some listeners that go, well, I don't really see it, and it was hard for me to see it until I read your book. It really was. I kind of that the construct of race in America and how this is something that's just it's a component of it. I wanted to just you mentioned religious freedom and the sort of the illusion of religious freedom when it comes to definition of terms, and it comes so like, for example, religious freedom. I remember a letter that was from the Jewish community to then President Jefferson, that and then they sent this letter at the time, and they said there's a First Amendment and it doesn't apply to us, and he was like, yes. I don't know if you know the letter, and he said yes. And generally, what I say when I talk about religious freedom is that the First Amendment was started separation of church and state. There was a lot of Christian on Christian stuff going on at the time, and it's really a secondary or tertiary benefit that religious minorities were protected. Do you think that that's a precedent in this in the slide away from religious freedom for all and the freedom to believe, not believe, and change and choose? Just as a professor, as a lawyer and so forth.
So this is when you get into the debates between the living constitution versus originalism.
Right.
And it's interesting because there's a parallel debate within Islamic law about the between the reformist Islamic legal scholars who believe that we should develop the law based on developments in society, and others who say no, we need to go back to the days of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and that is the golden era, and those were the best Muslims, and we should try to be as identical as possible as them so that we can all go to heaven.
Sure.
And so when I hear the debates between the originalists and the living constitutionalists, I think they have no, they
Yeah. Yeah.
American constitutional scholars, well, not many, but some of them believe that Islamic law is backward and stagnant and antithetical to their own legal system. When in fact there's quite a bit of similarity. So the the history speaks for itself. Is in law is always a product of that particular historical moment and the power structure, who's drafting the laws, what their interests are, what their clashing interests are, and what kind of society they envision
Right.
for is for the common good or for their own personal gain. And so we can't get around the fact that our legal system, like any other country's legal system, is developed based on that time and place and people when it was
Right.
without the colonial influence, and then they have what they tried to create anew, and then they have their cultural influence and so on and so forth. So I think that you are correct that many of the debates and the disputes that shaped the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, were based on intra Christian differences and most certainly based on the Protestants' experience in England. And they brought that over and said, we want to create this new utopian society, right? Manifest destiny, the a city on the hill, et cetera. And I addressed that in the
Sure.
beginning of my book.
Right.
But then but that applies to almost every constitutional concept and tenet because it was drafted, over 250 years ago. So now we need to ask ourselves, what does the Constitution mean? What does the First Amendment mean? I am a believer in the living Constitution. I think especially in the United States, and this is something else that makes the U.S. very unique. Some of the European countries are starting to have similar experiences, such as the UK. What's so unique about the U.S. is that there it's an immigrant country, and there is no majority, even religiously, between Protestants and Catholics within the Protestant faiths.
Right.
And now you are starting to see so many new faiths coming: Hinduism, Islam, Judaism. I mean, they're not new, but more and more people who are immigrating are of those faiths. And you can't have a society that's legal system privileges only one particular religion if it's so diverse. And so that's really, I think, the challenge is, how do you allow everyone to thrive without imposing one particular religious system on the other? And that's where the Christian nationalists really buck heads with other faiths, or Christians who are not Christian nationalists.
Right.
Because, and that's where you have a problem on the conservative political side and the Republican conservative political side, where many of their leaders are Christian nationalists. And they
Right.
believe this is a Christian nation. We need to bring religion back into schools. And in their view, that means their version of Christianity. We need to bring religion into public life and into politics, their version of Christianity. And that is a very intolerant and non inclusive vision of society, which is not feasible given the context we're in. It's simply not feasible. And if they were the minority, they would believe that. So the question becomes, well, how do you create a system where devout Christians don't feel they're being persecuted, devout Muslims don't believe they're being persecuted, devout Jews don't believe they're being persecuted, and seculars don't believe that they're being persecuted, and everyone in between? It's not an easy, there's no answer to it. And I think that's really what the religious freedom legal scholarly community is constantly debating and discussing and thinking about, well, what are the consequences of this ruling? What are the consequences of the interpretation of this statute or a new statute or the regulations? And thinking about it from different communities' perspectives, because you are going to experience it very differently,
Right.
right?
Well,
You can have, for example, you know, a lot of Muslims, when they're in a work environment and they say, well, we really don't want we don't want the look of the company to include kind of obviously religious clothing.
sure.
And yet there's no problem if a Christian's wearing a cross that can be seen.
Yeah.
And because to them, it's like, well, that doesn't really count. Well, for us, a hijab doesn't really count either.
Sure, sure, yeah, yeah. No, it's funny because yeah. There's a lot of things that are normal. Like I wear my topi everywhere, but and that's just normal. It helps if your hairline's receding as well. So that helps a little bit. So some of it's very practical, but I think that there's this conversation is very relevant now with the Trump administration. The shift from religious freedom to religious liberty is a slide, right? Religious freedom from American perspective or constitutional perspective is freedom to believe, not believe, change, and choose. And then you have this religious liberty. So, like all the religious freedom components of the government, there was a faith-based neighborhoods sort of initiative that was in most of the departments or most of the agencies. The IRF office is still present. The International Religious Freedom Office at the Department of State is still there. But things like the USERF, the United States Commission for National Religious Freedom. But the president's office now in the White House, in the executive branch, is it's the Council for Religious Liberty, and which has changed from freedom to believe, not believe, change and choose, to expression of faith. And there's like 4 bullet points, but one of the bullet points is to stop anti-Christian bias, right? And so it's not anti faith or non-faith bias. It's anti-Christian bias. And so it's really strange because I've talked with administrations since Clinton, right? And so when I talk with this administration, they're like, we've restored a Christian we've restored a Christian nation and Christian president, which I'm always like, every president's been Christian. What are you talking about? And then I get to the next thing, and I go, so tell me about the anti-Christian bias, because I mentioned months ago when this started the idea that the First Amendment was Christian on Christian bias, and it was the Christian on Christian elements that really was part of and parcel of the First Amendment. And now I've got, because of the religious freedom space, some of this grumblings of the other Christians. And I said, you're going to have a problem with this, because other Christians are going to try to figure out that you're speaking of one maktab, one sect of Christianity, and you're not really being inclusive of the others. And so this shift with the Trump administration is profound. And maybe when you look at from the backdrop of your book related to this shift, what's your take on that, and how that affects religious freedom and the most vulnerable populations in the country, Muslims, Sikhs, Zoroastrians, and so forth?
Well, when I listen to what I call the religious cultural wars, the American religious culture wars, and they are often between Christians,
Yeah,
between the majority group. And Christian meat obviously is very expansive definition. There's Catholic, there's Protestant,
right,
there's Orthodox, and then within Protestant, and then the Orthodox, there's Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, right? So it's a world religion, and it's very complicated. But I see the religious freedom culture wars, or the religious liberty culture wars, as an intra-Christian issue, because at least in this point in time, that kind of relatively diverse group has the most power as a collective, as compared to Hindus, Jews, Muslims, Zoroastrians, right? The numbers are just so different and so
sure,
disparate. Uh, so when I observe them, I think this reminds me of the debates in the Middle East between the Muslim Brotherhood, between the Salafis and the Wahhabis, between kind of self-identifying secular Muslims, or or more accurately, Muslims who believe that your religion should really be in your private life and are not supportive of it, of having state religion in an official capacity. And then those who are kind of borderline atheists. Uh, so these are very common religious culture wars in every world religion.
yeah,
But I don't think this is about Muslims or other religious minorities. I think this is about a certain very devout or self-described devout practicing evangelical Christians who, in their religious beliefs, um, think that society should be, uh, government should be intersecting and intertwined with religion. I don't think that they are supportive of the Establishment Clause, whether they admit it or not.
right,
And those groups are really the mirror image of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis and Wahhabis in Muslim majority countries, because those groups believe that religion and politics should be intertwined to different degrees. The Salafis and Wahhabis are what we would call more to the right and much more fundamentalist and literalist in their interpretation. The Muslim Brotherhood is at least relatively considered to be more tolerant of incorporating modern changes. And then you have people, farther to the left.
sure,
Ironically, if you tell that to the Christian evangelicals or the Christian nationalists, they rebuke that, because they see the Muslim Brotherhood and the political Islamists as completely, different than them. But you're like, no, actually, you're the American version of it,
yeah,
especially from the vantage point of either religious minorities or Christians who do not agree with Christian nationalism. I mean, when I say Christian nationalism, I mean that American identity, national identity, and Christian identity are one. That to be American is to be Christian. Right? So it's the same as saying to be Egyptian is to be Muslim. Where does that leave the 14% of Christian Coptics?
Sure.
So, and Americans, especially the evangelicals, have no problem asking that question of Muslim majority countries and criticizing them and showing them and calling them out for religious intolerance. But then when you explain to them, well, aren't you doing the same thing? Then they revert, ironically and somewhat laughably, well, that's anti-Christian bias. Well,
Right.
in order for bias to exist, there also has to be power.
Sure.
Otherwise, it's really just opinion, right?
Yeah.
Bias is where you can act on it and harm people in ways that are not beyond just, okay, I have a negative opinion of you. So this is where I find it somewhat comical when they say anti-Christian bias is, you mean you're upset that you can't dominate, that you can't impose your interpretation of Christianity and establish it through government practices and policies on the entirety of society.
Right.
And we should analyze that problem the same way we
Yeah.
analyze it in a Muslim majority country, in a Hindu majority country. I mean, we have the same problem with Hindutva in India,
Yeah.
and other countries. So we just need to be more consistent in how we identify it, examine it, and resolve it. But I will kind of circle back that I think the people who are the most opposed to it are other Christians
Yeah.
who do not want religion in school for their Christian children, who do not want religion in politics for their Christian communities. They believe that to be an American is to be committed to the separation of religion and politics and religion and state. So it's really an intra-Christian culture war, uh, from my vantage point as a Muslim.
Right. Yeah, that's how I kind of described it to him. And I was like, that you the other Christians are going to be the biggest problem. It's not really you have to worry about us. We're like I don't want to say fight, but our struggles hasn't changed. We're just trying to find agency, and not necessarily get
I mean, I will add that we certainly will be harmed if
sure,
there is a required Bible study in public schools. That certainly harms those who are not Christian, who don't believe they should have to read the Bible or their children should have to read the Bible. But there are also Christians who say that's for church, or you can send your kid to a private religious school. Well, and this is also the other irony is, well, the double standard, I will say. There are people on the right who, on the one hand, are big believers in charter schools, big believer in privatization, big believers in telling in saying if you don't like what's happening by the state, create your own.
right,
And you do have the freedom to do that. It's more
sure,
costly and it's more inconvenient. And there are many Islamic schools and Hebrew schools and
yeah,
Catholic schools, but what these folks want, they know they want it both ways. They want the privatization option, but they also want to use the state and use the resources of the state to impose the ways, the lifestyles or the
yeah,
public consensus process. And they're not going to win. Maybe in some small communities, they will. But then
yeah,
again, they still face the First Amendment anti-establishment clause, which is the protection of minorities against majorities. Is you still cannot, I mean, you're going to need to amend the Constitution. The state cannot favor one religion over the other.
right,
Or you can say, fine, we won't favor one or the other, but we'll allow everybody. So we will have one class that will be a religious class, but
right,
everybody gets to have their own religious class. So you have
sure,
Bible study, you have Quran studies, you have nobody wants to study any religious text. It
yeah.
has to be same. You can't favor or disfavor. And interestingly, they don't want that either, which I am somewhat confounded. And that's what makes me wonder, okay, this isn't really about interpretation of your religion on the entire society through the state. And you've got a problem, and it's called the First Amendment.
Right. Well, when it comes to, do you think it's uniquely American, or when you look towards Europe, when you look towards overseas, I remember with the Bosnian War, John Major and Mitterrand both saying that they wanted to restore Christian Europe, and then they imposed that the arms embargo on the Bosnians, and so that rings in my head a little bit from this. But I wanted, do you see a difference between this is a uniquely American thing with the First Amendment and Christian nationalism, along with the Trump sort of administration and how they're kind of moving forward, and when I think of like restoring Christian Europe, sort of that idea or that ideal, and we know the history of the Moors and the Ottomans and all this other stuff. But do you see a difference, or do you see it as something being similar or an import of what do you think is similar and dissimilar?
Yeah. Well, that's a tough question because you're talking across time and across space. But
Sure.
I will say that in the US is a very religious country. It's
Right.
always been a very religious country, especially as a Christian country. And the pendulum has been swinging. And if you read through the history of especially Protestantism and the various strands of it and its tensions with Catholicism, especially in the early 20th century when a large influx of Italians and Irish Catholics were immigrating in the millions, which was creating all sorts of anti-Catholic racism and bias, which I talk about in my book, The Racial Muslim. So that has been and the millennialists, there's a rich history of Christian nationalism in the US. And the pendulum swings because we have had a few decades in the past where people have become unchurched, where, I mean, the numbers are pretty clear that there are less Americans connected to a church, connected to a Christian community than their parents or their grandparents.
Sure.
And that also has created some angst and some proselytizing domestically by evangelical groups. And I think as you also see what I call the browning of America, meaning that whites, people of European origin, will not be the majority race by 2040 and possibly and at least definitely by 2050.
Right.
So these major changes in demographics is causing predictably a backlash by people who perceive, I think wrongfully, that somehow that's going to hurt them or hurt their children or hurt their grandchildren,
Right.
that somehow they're going to lose certain privileges or advantages rather than embrace it as an organic, natural change. And the same thing's happening in Europe right now because for the last, I believe, 30 years, Europe has experienced being a destination for immigrants, whereas
Yeah.
before that, it was exporting immigrants. And those immigrants coming into Europe do not have the same skin color, do not have the same religion, do not have the same languages, and they're coming from outside Europe. Although there's also bias against Eastern Europeans because they're also migrating in large numbers to Western Europe. But there are Muslims, there are Hindus, there are Spanish speaking Christians from Latin America, there are Africans of various faiths. So that's creating angst among people in Europe, various countries who believe that, oh, we're this homogeneous society with this one religion and one identity, when in fact, historically, they've never been that. And so the pendulum is swinging, and they're using the migrants as scapegoats. The right wing, the rise of the right, are using the migrants as scapegoats to try to recruit people to their very right wing ethno-nationalist ideology. And I'll just put a plug in for another book that I just published. I co-edited with John Esposito called Global Islamophobia and the Rise of Populism, where we explore that connection, that intersection, because what we saw was a through line between the rise of the right and the rise of Islamophobia in Europe, in Asia, and in North America.
Huh.
Yeah, there are other factors that have contributed to the rise of the right, but Islamophobia has certainly been a dominant factor because Muslims are easy scapegoats, especially in European and North American contexts, and sadly, also increasingly in the Indian context. So, yeah, there are certainly a lot of connections, but I still think we need to be focused country by country because each one has its unique history. And the issue with Christian nationalism is I think, more a product of rising secularism than it is a product of religious minorities' presence. When you think of same sex marriage, when you think of abortion, when you think of contraception, when you think of prayer in schools, when you think of transgender issues in transgender sports, those have nothing to do with Muslims, Jews, Hindus. That's all
Sure.
Americans who either are not religious or who are Christian but have a different interpretation, and other Christians who are evangelical and are much more conservative, debating and disagreeing,
Right.
of various races, by the way, about those key culture war topics. But it is not the Muslims or the Jews or the Hindus or the Zoroastrians or the Sikhs that are on the front line of these culture wars.
Right. Yeah. No, it's an interesting. It's an interesting point, and that I know we're coming at the top of the hour. I wanted to make sure that I asked you this question about how what's a community, what are we supposed to do? And I mean by we, I mean vulnerable populations, minorities, religious minorities who are racialized in America or abroad, but particularly America. What are we supposed to do? I mean, I know I've been slugging it out in the religious freedom space, international development space, and all this other stuff, and I have the idea of at least showing up, being heard, engaging, and just like the podcast is part of it, right? And my articles are another part of it. But this racialization, the idea, it took a little while for me to kind of understand and digest, and I'm sold. So but in the same respect, I'm now thinking of it, as I'm accepting it and accepting the concept. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the tools, or the mechanisms that you might be exposed to throughout your career. So, and I know that our listenership is always curious about what's going on. I mean, if you're just Zoroastrian, you're Hindu, and you're struggling with this, what can a person do? And maybe you could point them not just to your book, but uh, the tools for them to socialize themselves with, how to advocate for themselves and advocate for, um, um, you know, hedging towards a more free and just society.
Well, there is no silver bullet, but I do think there are certain practices that help protect minority communities, and also I think serve American society in a beneficial way. So the first, I think, the most important step is to engage in cross-racial coalitions. When
Yeah,
you are a numerical minority,
right.
structurally, you are not going to win elections. You are not going to be fully represented in the executive branch or in the civil service or in any spaces of power because you don't have the numbers.
Sure.
And that in some ways is the reason why you're vulnerable in a majoritarian political system, right? Because
Yeah,
it is the majority voters. So that means that you have to create a majority based on your alliances with other communities who have common interests and
sure.
common ideological commitments that are mutually beneficial. And that's why you're seeing with the young generation, the current college students, or those who I would say are under 35, who kind of came of age during Black Lives Matter, you're seeing a huge shift in their coalition based advocacy. And they're realizing you can't fight against casteism without fighting against Islamophobia. You can't combat anti Semitism without also combating Islamophobia and anti Palestinian racism. Because unfortunately, the causes are often the same or the origins are the same. And so that's the first thing is people need to make sure they're not in bubbles or, cultural bubbles or identity bubbles and social enclaves. I don't think you can expect that from new immigrants. That's too much to ask for because if if an American who was raised in America who speaks English, who's Christian, moves to a foreign country where they
Yeah,
speak a different language, it's not a Christian majority country, it's a completely different culture. what they're going to do is they're going to look for others who are similar to them, and they're going to find solace, protection, and comfort.
Sure.
But their children, who will be raised in that different country, they will become part of that new country. So I don't think it's fair and realistic to expect the new immigrants from wherever they come from to be the leaders of social change and civic engagement. And they can do it if they choose to, but I think that's something that's not a reasonable expectation. So this is really for those who were either raised in America or born and raised in America. The second is you really need to focus on structural reforms. The Establishment Clause is intended to protect religious minorities. Religious
Right.
majorities don't need protection because the
Right.
system is shaped by them, defined by them. And similarly, free speech is intended to protect dissidents. It is not intended to protect those who hold majoritarian political views.
Right.
And the same thing with racial minorities. So anyone who belongs to a vulnerable community, however vulnerability is defined, should have a strong vested interest in the structures that protect minorities from the tyranny of the majority. And that really depends on the context, right? Whether you have the 1964 Civil Rights Act that protects people in employment, protects people who, whether Title VII or Title VI, where you can't engage in race, color, or national origin discrimination if you get federal funding, Title IX against sex discrimination, and so on and so forth. But those structural reforms benefit everyone who's vulnerable. So, again, going back to these cross racial coalitions, the other is I am not, I have my critiques of interfaith engagement only because sometimes they end up becoming these very superficial, feel good exercises that don't change systems and are oftentimes just more about making excuses for disparities and inequality and making those who benefit from that inequality feel less guilty.
Sure. Yeah.
However, that being said, I still think it's always good to engage with people who are different from you, whether it's interfaith or interracial or interclass. And that is because one structural problem we have in American society right now is it's a very segregated society along class and along race, because those two intersect. Um, and that makes it easier to vilify a group of people that's different from you if you've never interacted with them. That's a universal phenomena. Right?
Right.
If the Copts in Egypt are completely isolated from the Muslims in Egypt, it's much easier to vilify the Copts to the majority Muslims. But if they live together and go to school together and work together and they're friends and they attend each other's marriage, wedding ceremonies. If the state tries to create some sort of scapegoating propaganda, the population just won't be primed for it. They're going to reject it and go, no, because I know these people, they're my friends. And so
Sure.
I think that's also important for minorities. But we have to keep in mind that there is a limitation to that. If there are only 6 million Muslims in America, and that's considered a high estimate,
Sure.
how many people do they have to meet that are non-Muslim for them to make a systemic impact? It's almost
Right. Yeah.
about cultural production and movies and films. And that's where it is the responsibility of those that are in the majority position, those who have white privilege and Christian privilege and wealth privilege. And if they really are committed to inclusive and diverse society where it's not so easy to scapegoat people who are different and who are minorities, they have a responsibility to make sure that they include those people and those perspectives and those cultures in cultural production, right?
Sure.
In knowledge production, in journalism. And if they don't do that, I think they're part of the problem. Now, some of them won't do it because they're ideologically against it. And I usually call those people racists and classists and Islamophobes. But there is a large swath of Americans who we'll call liberal Americans and liberal white Americans and liberal Christians.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think they are using their privilege, which again is a responsibility, to act in furtherance of those commitments. And only they can do it. right?
Right.
So as a professor, I have a certain amount of privilege, and it is my responsibility as a professor that I ensure my privilege creates more equity, more inclusion, more diversity, so that those who don't walk in the door with those privileges, they don't continue to be disadvantaged by that. But if I don't do that proactively and conscientiously to make sure all of my students feel that they have an equal opportunity and all of my students feel that they have the ability, the equal ability to learn, then I just become a passive contributor to the inequality that I may not have caused, right? It's part of society, but I
Correct.
can't pretend that it doesn't, that I'm not affected by it or that I don't contribute to it. We're all within the system. We
Sure.
all shape the system in our own ways. Some of us can shape it much more powerfully than others based on our position in society and our wealth and our identities. But to do nothing to me is just as harmful, or at least harmful, maybe not equivalently, but it certainly does cause harm, just as to intentionally try to hurt minorities does. And we
Right.
do need to distinguish between those two. But I just want to note that one of the most troubling aspects of our current time, under the Trump administration, is the normalization of authoritarian sensibilities.
Mm.
And I find that to be probably the most depressing part of the current moment. Again, going back to 9/11, going back to how I had been educated in this country, really believing this country is not as vulnerable or susceptible to authoritarianism. Yes, we're going to debate, we're going to dispute, we're going to have these really, really heated and contested disagreements, but we all are committed to democratic principles and democratic sensibilities.
Like war powers, and you're talking about like war powers and the Insurrection Act, deploying troops, that sort
Right,
of.
meaning that if you disagree, you don't go to jail.
Yeah.
If you dissent, you don't go to jail. If you um,
Or deplatform.
don't like the president or criticize the president, you don't get investigated and prosecuted or deported.
Right.
Uh, and that if you're an elected official and you're opposed to the executive branch's policies on immigration, you don't get arrested and prosecuted. I mean,
Right.
those are very authoritarian practices.
Sure.
So I think what's important for all of us, but most certainly for the majority, because the system is a majoritarian political system, it's really important that we put our partisan commitments aside. There are some things that are purely partisan, and there are some things that are truly about are nationalistic.
Sure.
And if you disagree with the current administration, you do what a Democrat does, which is you oppose it, you try to reform it, but you wait until it's your turn and you run for the next elections. But
Right.
if you're in jail, or you've been deported, or you've been prosecuted, or you've been harassed, or you've been intimidated, you can't do that.
Right.
That's what dictatorship is. So I do hope that the listeners, whether you're Republican or Democrat or none of the above, I think that we have to be united in ensuring that the rules of the game stay fair, right? Like a sport. No cheating. Dictatorship is cheating, and authoritarianism is cheating, right? It's saying that you made a goal and I'm going to go take out your legs so you can never make a goal again. Rather
Right.
than you made a goal and now I'm going to up my game and practice better and try to make my own goal. But no cheating. And so I think that's what I'm most worried about right now, which of course always affects minorities.
Sure.
But it's not a problem just for minorities. It truly is, I think, a domestic national security problem, a political security problem.
No, without a doubt. Well, I appreciate the commentary. I mean, it's very candid, and that means a lot to, I think, not only to me but the listenership, when we're talking about what's going on, and from someone with your subject matter expertise and your experience, it means a lot for you to share that with not only me but the listenership. So I appreciate you taking the time, Professor. It means a lot. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.